Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko hongere ingarahi te moana, no ingarangi me airangi o ko Tepuna, ko Ngāti Pākehā e te iwi. No Plymouth ingarangi me tamaki makaura ahau. Ko Paul toko matua, ko Barbara toko whaia, ko James Stanley toko ingoa. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora. Kia ora everyone, thanks for coming along. It's a real pleasure to be here and see friends and colleagues from across the years to talk about a bunch of stuff, essentially. Those of you who haven't been to an IPL before might not know they're a slightly weird mix of personal reminiscencing, perhaps at too much length, as well as talking about different pieces of work that I've been involved in, as well as the theme of tonight's talk. So there'll be a bit of a mix of everything in here. This is going to be the point where I realise that my slides are probably going to auto-advance, which I should turn off very quickly. There you go. When you've done this enough, you know how to get the buttons working really quickly. So this is me in my early life with my family in England. On the one side you can see me with some tasty cake with some not quite so tasteful 1970s decor. And on the right with my mum Barbara, who is here today. We grew up in the south of England, so I was born in Plymouth, as I mentioned before, and grew up in Portsmouth. We always lived near the coast because my dad was in the Navy. Here you can see us on one of the ships in which he was an officer on the left, with so that's my dad Paul and my brother Duncan in the middle as well. And on the other side you can see my sister Claire and my brother Duncan with me wedged in the middle there. Here are some other photos from before we left the UK. On the left is on a canal in my dad's hometown of Wigan with my grandfather and grandmother in the background and with a couple of other cousins in the mix as well. And at the top right you can see us at Christmas dinner just before we left the UK actually with my nan and granddad and with my great-grandmother, my mum's grandmother as well in the back. And that's taken in the house where my mum grew up in Bampton in Devon. So as I mentioned, my dad was in the Navy, and when I was about 7, he took a transfer, we took a transfer to come and live in New Zealand. And prior to doing that, we were invited to a friend's house to watch a promotional movie to find out a little bit more about life in New Zealand. Unfortunately, they didn't have any New Zealand-specific material, so they did the best they could. As you can imagine, this was a source of confusion for some time, but we sorted it out eventually. So in December 1984, we did a bit of a ground trip around the UK, bidding family farewell, and moved to Auckland in 1985. Living in Auckland was quite a change. This is, I think, when we were living in Devonport initially. Coming from the south of England, where there aren't really any particular hills to merit, it was definitely quite a change. We could see Rangitoto from our kitchen window and was a sort of quite present part of our life moving around on the North Shore. And my dad worked on a literal volcanic cone in Devonport teaching navigation to trainee officers. One of the other things about moving to New Zealand was it meant quite a big change to our family life as well. When we lived in the UK, my dad would be away for quite extended periods at sea. And so being together made life a lot simpler and it was a very nice change for all of us. So that's my dad in the whites with the binoculars around his neck on the left. It did mean fewer family visits on Navy ships, watching fake pirates walk real planks. That's not my dad on the plank. But one advantage of my dad not being away at sea for months on end was that he wasn't at risk of scurvy. And this is one of those awkward transition points to try and get to the point of today's talk. So, this will all become clear in a few minutes as we go. As you may well know, scurvy is a serious and fatal disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. It's been known since antiquity, and up until the late 18th century, it was a really serious cause of mortality on long trips at sea. In a sense, it was really a symptom of success. The kinds of provisions used, say, in the British Navy that allowed people to make long journeys across the open sea were not conducive to good health. At the time, there were lots of theories and potential solutions. And in fact, we'll see in a second that some of the solutions were found without fully understanding the underlying mechanisms, which is an ongoing point, really, in health research nowadays. So I'm going to use this kicking off point, which does tie into my family life, to talk about structured investigation. And one of the reasons that I'm bringing up scurvy is in the context of James Lind, who was an officer in the Royal Navy in the mid 18th century, so in the 1750s. And he really started off some structured investigation in how we can think about health in these contexts that in a sense has been formalised into what we now think of as the research process. So in 1753, James Lind published this treatise on the scurvy in 3 parts, which is really the results of his structured investigation into what causes scurvy and what the potential cures for scurvy were. And generally this is considered one of the first comparative trials, one of the first comparative studies in history. And what he did was he took 12 sailors with scurvy, so early studies tended to have small sample sizes too, for those of you who work in health research. And when they were returning to Plymouth from a long sailing trip, he kept them under controlled conditions to see what different treatments might do in terms of improving scurvy. Some of the luckier sailors were assigned to get cider. A few of the less lucky ones were given seawater or vinegar. And most famously, and as you probably know, some of them were given fresh citrus fruit. And for those of you who haven't seen a lemon in its natural habitat, here's one here. That is you, yeah. So you might think that the matter was now sealed. They'd done this study and they'd found that using citrus fruits could help prevent and treat scurvy. But the uptake wasn't as quick as you might hope. Some of this was due to early missteps in the way that these citrus fruits were delivered. So early preservation of citrus tended to involve boiling, which destroys vitamin C. But it also took time to convince those in charge to make the necessary changes. And that's an experience that a lot of academics might sympathise with. It also doesn't help that the relevant observations from the trial made up about 6 pages in the middle of a 450-page book. And for people who've tried to make policy decisions based on academic work, that might ring some bells as well. To keep going, the history of scurvy and treatment of scurvy is also inextricably linked to the colonisation of New Zealand. So James Cook, on his trip to the Pacific in the endeavour to observe the transit of Venus in 1769, this is before opening his secret instructions to further explore the South Pacific and hence the European arrival in New Zealand, was also involved in documenting different methods for preventing scurvy, including citrus fruits and sauerkraut here on the right. You'd be lucky not to be assigned to be given sauerkraut in an early trial, as well as other treatment options that we now know to be ineffective as well. Nowadays, historians generally accept that it was actually regular restocking of fresh fruit and vegetables when on land that was really the key factor behind the success of these sailings in terms of avoiding scurvy. But that wasn't the end either. These methods were effective for ending scurvy in nautical settings, but there was still a problem in other settings. For instance, when we looked at imprisoned people on restricted nutrient-light diets. And again, part of the problem was that the mechanisms were still poorly understood. And it wasn't until the late 1930s and modern biochemistry that we got to the discovery and description of vitamin C and that we started to really understand the mechanisms underlying scurvy. Sticking with a few hundred years back, it's also pretty much mandatory for any talk of this kind to talk about John Snow and cholera, so my apologies to people who've been to an epi-themed talk before. But really this is a continuing theme about how people were starting to think about health in a structured fashion that we can still recognise in modern health research and see applied in terms of using these lessons in the real world. So at the time, this is in the 1850s, there were lots of competing theories around what caused cholera, including theories about miasma, basically bad air, as a cause. And what John Snow did was during one particular outbreak in 1854, is that he plotted the different cases, and let's see if I can use the mouse with my left hand here. You can see these little bars here next to different residences indicating cases of cholera as they arose. And what he worked out was the unifying factor was that most of these households were in a neighbourhood that was supplied by one water pump in Broad Street, which if I got the dot in the right place is where the red circle is there, and it sort of forms the epicentre of this particular cholera outbreak. So in those days, water reform wasn't a multi-year legislative process at high risk of politicisation. It was a more hands-on decision-making process, and they went and took the handle off the pump. Although that's the legend as it goes, things possibly might have been on the wane at that stage. It's also a useful time to note that while this is the famous story about cholera and cholera transmission in John Snow, he also documented other avenues of transmission between people and from contaminated food as well. And this is a reminder that we tend to like simpler stories about causes of disease and treatments, but actually these are really complex and often draw on multiple different strands. It's also an illustration that solving these problems requires resources and political willpower. So cholera in particular, as you probably know, is still of international concern, particularly in areas with inadequate sanitation and tenuous water supplies. I'm going to pivot back around to talk a bit more about myself for a while now. So it was time for me to start my own structured investigations, and after finishing school I moved to Dunedin to study psychology. I enjoyed it so much that I ended up staying on for a PhD as well, and I made some of my best friends there, some of whom in this bottom picture at the left with the dog of two of our flatmates superimposed on the top are here tonight or will be watching at some point. And that's also where I met Melissa, who I have to remember where she is in the audience, who is here tonight. This is very clearly not taken in Dunedin at the top right, but that was the photo we decided to go with. So it was a great time, and I stayed on to complete a PhD with Professor Bob Knight in the psychology department. It was also at this time that I got my first proper taste of statistics, teaching or tutoring third-year psychology students with Jeff Miller. And those of you who've been through psychology in Dunedin have very possibly done this paper, which is a rite of passage for that group. And taking on this teaching really proved the rule that if you want to understand something yourself, you really need to be able to explain it to other people. And that's something that I've continued to work on and try to address and deal with as time has gone on as well. It's been a while since I completed my PhD. In fact, it's coming up to its 21st anniversary this year, but you don't forget the support you got or the friendships you built while studying. So this is a good time to salute the students I've supervised or taught here, including, I have to look around to see where Zara is, who is hopefully submitting next Thursday with her PhD. Everything is on track, which is great. As William mentioned before, working with students is a real pleasure in terms of seeing people develop and move on. And so there are other students here or online who I've supervised in the past, and it's a real pleasure to see you again. I'd like to also acknowledge the many students I've had shorter or longer conversations with over the years. And on top of that, it's been really nice to have some of these students go on to become colleagues, to see where they're working in other settings as well, either here in New Zealand or overseas. So at the end of my PhD, I was ready to leave Dunedin, but still keen to learn more. And so in 2004, I moved to Birmingham to start a postdoc in neuroscience, which was looking at how the control of movement in the brain reintegrates sensory feedback to make sense and refine movements, and also how we interact with other people as well. My first impressions of Birmingham were very much tempered by the cold and the darkness. So I arrived in late January, and though the university is billed as being in green, leafy Edgbaston, there weren't too many leaves to be seen at that time of year. And a couple of weeks after I arrived, this is a photo of one of the canals in Birmingham being quite famous for its canals. And the bits that look a little bit like waves are actually ice on the canal where the whole thing froze over. This was quite an impressive sight. It did also have the added benefit of reducing the number of attacks by the Canada geese, who usually lived on the towpath, and took this opportunity to spend time on top of the canal surface instead. One of my other early memories of moving to Birmingham was in the, even though I wasn't a postgraduate student, I spent a few weeks staying in postgraduate student accommodation, and a couple of guys from Papua New Guinea came up from one of the other blocks in the postgrad accommodation because they heard someone else from the Southern Hemisphere had arrived, and they were very keen to meet me, and so that sort of formed the basis of an ongoing friendship in my time there as well. I joined Professor Chris Mile, who just moved from the University of Oxford to Birmingham, and this was a really great experience. However, I think I could have seen the New Zealand summer out because when I arrived, they were still setting up their computers and their lab equipment. This led to some interesting conversations, such as when I asked where the library was. I was told that was a good question and could I please report back when I'd found out. In fact, one of my postdoc colleagues told me that actually he never really bothered going to the library anymore because if he couldn't find a paper online, it probably wasn't worth reading. That's kind of very much true now, but in 2004 it was perhaps wishful thinking. Now, when you work in academia, it's often quite hard to get photos at work where you're not just posed at a desk. But working in neuroscience, you have a few more opportunities. Here on the bottom right is actually a picture of my brain with activity from a functional MRI study. So this is from a published paper in Neuroimage. So that's one opportunity that's open to you. On the left is a relatively memorable trip from my early days where we went to do a functional MRI data analysis course that was held in a castle in Würzburg in Germany, which is still the most impressive conference/workshop venue that I've ever been to. And at the top right, in what is not a very good photo, which I blame on the quality of digital cameras in 2004 or 2005, my colleague Emma Gowan, who was another postdoc with me at the time there. But this trip was also early notice that you can't leave thoughts or reminders of home behind you. We were actually in Würzburg for the 2004 transit of Venus, so we got up early and spent some time, I think, in front of the train station trying to observe Venus moving across the sun's surface using a couple of bits of paper and a pin, which was not as successful as we might hope. Overall, it's a really great time being in the UK, and I was really lucky to be able to spend time with my extended family. Here I have my grandfather Donald, who is my mum's father, on the left. But home was calling, and 3 years in the UK was really enough at this stage. The winters were cold and dark. Here's a different stretch of frozen canal, this time from in the Jewellery Quarter, taken leaning out of the window of one of our apartments that we lived in. There are also lots of different reminders of New Zealand as well, from simple things like hearing Crowded House playing at the supermarket, or slightly more unexpected things like coming home to find my Greek flatmate, who was a really keen basketball fan, watching the All Blacks play Wales and Cardiff on the TV. I didn't mention this at the start, so if you're one of these people who likes to keep track of how we're going, this talk's in 3 parts, so when we get to the third part, you'll know we're on the home stretch. So we came back to New Zealand at the end of 2006. It was really great to see family again, my parents, my sister and her family, including my niece who's here today, and my nephew who is potentially watching online as well. But it was time to look for a job as well. Having come from the UK where the funding and the general size of the research infrastructure is quite big, it's possible to spend your career stringing together grants into an academic career. Or potentially find permanent academic roles in a nearby city without having to move several hours away. As many people here will know, that's much harder to do in New Zealand. So when we returned, Melissa was working as a clinical psychologist in Napier. At this time I was job hunting, reading, doing a little bit of swimming in the sea. And when I was looking for photos, I found this view of Aotearoa from the Hawke's Bay Museum Trust. That's a very uncanny approximation of the view from where we were living at the time, looking roughly to the north. In fact, I'm pretty sure that building in the foreground might still be there as well. At this stage, I would have described myself still as someone who was comfortable with statistics rather than as a statistician. Certainly having gone through psychology, it was an area of strength of mine, but I still viewed myself as an applied scientist. But that didn't stop me applying for a job at UOW as a biostatistician. Maybe that sounds a bit more of a risky proposition than when I wrote it, but never mind. Times were different back then. I was able to do a remote interview for the job from a landline in our landlord's bedroom in the flat that we were sharing. This was obviously, well, I think Skype was even not yet a thing at that time. So even though it wasn't a video call, I still made sure I had a shirt and tie on to get in the zone. I had an interview with Tony Dowell, Peter Crampton and Gordon Purdy, who many of you will know as well. When I was offered the job, the cost, this is another flashback, the cost of making a phone call on a mobile phone at the time for someone without a job was so prohibitive that I actually made a 20-minute walk into town to call Tony Dowell from a telecom payphone booth to negotiate salary. And this is not a museum piece, but this is a payphone in the Johnsonville Mall, which is admittedly a bit of a museum piece in and of itself as well. I just took this last weekend. I wasn't out hunting for it. I just saw it when I was there with Mila and Cora. So moving to health sciences was a real challenge, thinking about the types and volume of data that we tend to work with and the different statistical approaches from what we dealt with in psychology. So those first years were a real apprenticeship in statistics for me. So I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people here. First and foremost at the top, my senior colleague and friend Gordon Purdy, who many of you will know and was a long-time statistician here. And Gordon's wisdom and patience, both in helping me understand and expand in statistics, and more importantly, how to talk to people about statistics as well, was really fundamental to my development. And I'd also like to recognise Bridget Robson, who is here at the back, who's the director of the Eru Paumari Māori Health Research Centre. And Bridget, you've really been a guiding light for myself and many other Pākehā researchers in thinking about equity of health outcomes in New Zealand from one perspective, but also and with other colleagues like Mel and Ricky and Janine and others who are here, to think about how we can contribute as partners in research to come to better understanding and eventually action in these areas as well. So what kinds of evidence do we need to think about when we're making decisions about health? Historically, we've already seen some experiments and observation with James Lind and John Snow. But as we move on to more complex problems, we also need to have more complex methods as well. And luckily, statisticians have been there to design studies and to help gather and interpret the evidence as we go. I'm going to switch back to the topic again, so it's time for another slightly clunky juxtaposition. But one of the nice things about living in Wellington, as well as being reunited with good friends from Otago and my sister and her family as well, was being able to enjoy the city. And as you all know, being here, Wellington is a great city, lots of green space and so on. And this includes around Newtown. You might not know it from here, but we're only a few hundred metres away from the town belt. And the town belt has quite a bit of Wellington's health history in it as well. Many of you may know the former Wellington Fever Hospital up in the hills in the town belt. This is now the SPCA, and this is a good chance to drop in a couple of photos of our cats as well, just to mix up the talk a little bit. So the Fever Hospital, this is Stevie at the top, who was actually named at a housewarming party by our late colleague Matt Soberg, who is much missed, and Peppy on the bottom. So the Fever Hospital was opened in 1920 and generally was treating people with infectious diseases like influenza and scarlet fever. But by the 1940s, the patients were primarily people with tuberculosis. At the time, treatment for tuberculosis was quite limited, and generally this included the kind of measures you might see in TV shows or movies from the time, or historical photos, things like hospital buildings that were light, open and had good air circulation, or even external bedding for people to be in. And I think it's quite reasonable to say that there was no effective treatment really for TB at this stage. There was some understanding of what caused the disease, but no treatment in mind. This changed drastically in the late 1940s, with the major steps being the invention of the modern randomised controlled trial, or RCT, as a study design, but also the advent of antibiotics. And so the treatment under consideration for TB was the antibiotic streptomycin. This is actually, I think this is clarithromycin here, but I couldn't find a photo of streptomycin, and it probably came in a brown bottle at the time as well. And results from lab tests on cell cultures in guinea pigs looked quite promising for treating TB at this stage here. So the Medical Research Council, I think as it was at the time in the UK, set up a trial to look and see whether this treatment would work better than other existing treatments, of which it's fair to say there wasn't really one at the time. So they recruited just over 100 participants for their study who were aged 15 to 30 and who had confirmed bacterial tuberculosis. Half of them were randomised to receive streptomycin as well as bed rest, while the control group, the people who weren't getting the active treatment, had been randomised to bed rest only. And while the RCT was new, we can already see some key elements that are still there in modern design. This concept of having a fair comparison between groups with suitable control conditions, and using randomisation to assign people to those treatments to make those groups as similar as possible. The outcomes for the study were pretty clear. These are some x-rays of people's chests with pulmonary tuberculosis. And the main outcome of the study was looking at lung x-rays at 6 months after initiation of the trial. In the control group, just under 1 in 10 people were recorded as having substantial or considerable improvement from when they entered the study, but that was considerably higher at just over half of those who'd been randomised to streptomycin. There is a risk of bias in studies like this from these semi-subjective ratings of things like x-rays, but there was strong evidence from mortality as well. Almost half of the control group had died within 1 year, which is something that's perhaps not quite understandable to us nowadays, compared to 1 in 5 for the streptomycin group, and that was a really drastic difference. It's worth remembering this was the early days of antibiotics. It was only 20 years after Alexander Fleming had discovered penicillin in 1928. And so it's also worth bearing in mind that we're still not 100 years from the discovery of antibiotics, and from those of you who know about antibiotic stewardship and antibiotic resistance, this is going to be a major and ongoing problem to try and manage these medicines that are a really important part of modern treatment. So a century seems a long time, although as I'm coming up on 50 years, it suddenly doesn't seem quite so long as it did at an earlier stage in my life. But that's also roughly how long we've had another epidemic of distinctly human origin, the tobacco epidemic. So smoking, as you will all know, has long been known as a source of ill health in various ways, shapes or forms. But really the early 20th century, with industrialised production of cigarettes and marketing and various other issues, was when the tobacco epidemic really took off. So as antibiotics for TB were coming online, health researchers were also starting to seriously grapple with smoking and think about different causes of lung cancer. And in fact, the key statistician who designed and analysed the streptomycin trial, Austin Bradford Hill, was starting to work with Richard Dole on looking at causes of lung cancer as well. And there were several other studies around the same time, but this is one of the more famous ones, was what is called a case control study, which really looks a bit like a study turned back to front. This can be a bit confusing, a bit like the optical effect when you look through some types of telescope. Random photo. There aren't too many more random photos. This was the last image I put in because I really couldn't think of anything else to put here that wasn't a cigarette. So case control studies start off by finding people with a particular health outcome, and this people who had lung cancer in hospitals around London, and then finding a suitable comparison group who do not have that health outcome, but might otherwise be comparable in terms of other profile things, in terms of, say, socioeconomic status and local environment, for instance. Then we can take those two groups and compare the different aspects of their past experiences or behaviour to look to see whether those differ between those two groups. In this case, one of the main things they were looking at was whether people smoked. But actually the ubiquity of smoking at the time was so great that it wasn't necessarily high on the list of priorities as to what people thought might be behind the surge in lung cancer cases and various other things, which we still know nowadays are problems. Pollution from the general environment and from traffic and so on were alternative considerations as well. So Dole and Hill's studies was really one of the first of several studies that aimed to settle these questions, showing that those who had lung cancer were more likely to have been smokers than those who didn't have lung cancer. I'm not going to go into the details too much more here, and various other study designs using different approaches were able to firm up this evidence as time went on as well. So this is one of the nice parts of the talk for me, where I get to start talking a bit more about different people who I work with. So I'm going to segue to start off talking about tobacco control in New Zealand. And I'd like to, I'll just go through everyone from left to right at the top and then across the bottom here. So Professor Richard Edwards, who's here at the front and who'll be talking at the end of my talk, and Associate Professor Aotearoa, who's also here, as well as Janine Nip, Dan Totolo, Jude Ball, Ali Johnson and James Yang. So together, as part of this wider grouping of Aspire Aotearoa, which is a group for looking at research into a tobacco-free future, we've worked together on a series of studies called the ITC or EASE studies, which I won't go into too much of the acronyms, but looking into what people who smoke and people who've quit smoking think about different tobacco control measures in New Zealand, which different personal level factors might influence their chances of stopping smoking and various other related issues. So this comes back to a more general theme throughout this talk, which is that progress in general and progress in health is not a one-way street. And so we know nowhere is this more apparent than in the tobacco control sphere. And so we've recently been hearing arguments that there's insufficient evidence to make bold changes to deal with the tobacco epidemic, most recently seen in the repeal of the previous government's smoke-free legislation. It's also mentioned in some of these discussions that it's really important to listen to the voices of people who smoke in making these decisions and making changes. Well, I can tell you that of the work I've been involved in this area with Richard, Anaru and others, about 90% of that work has been directly asking the people who smoke or people who've quit smoking what they think about these measures. And if you ask them, they'll tell you they'd like more help to quit, and they don't mean access to more medications. Here for this slide, which is from a report that we put together with our colleagues at the University of Waterloo in Canada towards the end of last year, are some pie charts showing levels of support among people who smoke and people who've recently quit for the so-called smoke-free generation law that was part of the government's comprehensive smoke-free legislation. And what you can see if we just concentrate on the right-hand figure there, that almost 60% of people who smoke or recently quit supported or strongly supported that particular legislation. That's a snapshot from the end of 2022, but we still see high support from our more recent data as well. So another slightly random image, which will make more sense in a second. We really, as we move through what we're doing with health research, we're also moving from simpler to more complex questions. Having said that, modern randomised trials or observational studies are still recognisable evolutions of their mid-20th century counterparts. And the RCT in particular is still a mainstay of comparing treatment effectiveness, but updated. So as a simple example, we've moved from flipping coins to using a computer to randomise people between groups. And this was the first computer we had back in 1980 something. It's not the literal computer, even though I do have it in a drawer somewhere at home. Observational studies have certainly seen more methodological development, but we can see these evolutions from these early studies that showed us the links between smoking and cancer, or between high blood pressure and cardiovascular events. And while we've used a lot of fancy statistical methods across our projects, by and large, we've been taking well-designed studies using well-established statistical methods to answer our questions. And actually, for the questions that we deal with, a lot of these questions are about looking at what we might consider relatively everyday interventions that we can make. They're not about finding fancy new medications or fancy new ways of diagnosing particular conditions, but really hyper-focused on how we can make changes in health settings. And nowhere is this more true than in the work I've contributed to in the sphere of cancer. So here I've got on the right Diana Safati and on the left Jason Gurney. Microsoft PowerPoint insisted that one of you be on the left and the other on the right, and I could not change it and have the pictures stay how I wanted them. Di was here when I joined the med school in 2007, and we would have met a year or two after that. And actually with Richard Edwards, we used to teach together on the epidemiology and biostatistics course, which was another pillar really of my education and research, and a lot of fun, except for the marking. Jason joined the C3 group in early 2011 and has been one of my closest friends here at UOW ever since. Many of you may know Di, many of you here know Jason as well, but Di was instrumental in setting up Te Aotearoa, the New Zealand Cancer Control Agency, with an aim to better understand cancer diagnosis and treatment delivery in New Zealand. And she led Te Aotearoa from 2019, and as many of you will know, became Director General of Health in 2022. One thing that both Di and Jason are good at is assembling teams. And this photo at the top is from a working retreat in 2017, I think, up the Kapiti coast during one of our mid-period heydays in the C3 research group. This bottom photo is from earlier this year. You can only see about half my face in it, not that I'm particularly complaining, and it was taken by a random passerby rather than a selfie, which we managed to squeeze in on the top photo. And this was taken behind the Maranui Surf Club as we launched into the current HRC 5-year program grant that Jason is leading. So I don't need to be here telling you that cancer is important, but what can we think about and do in the cancer setting? One thing we can do is look at timely cancer diagnosis, because this is really critical to improving cancer outcomes and getting treatment to the people when they need it and when they can best benefit from it. This figure on the left is showing different risk in mortality over time compared to local lung cancers. These are both for lung cancer here. And what this shows is that cancer that's spread from the local area, so from the lung, has a much higher risk of mortality. And when cancer metastasizes, that's a further risk yet again. The figure on the right is a little bit harder to read. This is not from our work, but from work from international colleagues, which did include people from Te Aotearoa and other colleagues from Otago as well, Professor Christopher Jackson down in Dunedin. And what this shows, the point I want to show you on this is the green dot on the right-hand side, which the New Zealand should be lined up with that, but it moved at some point when I was resizing the slides. What this shows you is that if you look on the x-axis there, it shows you about half of all lung cancer cases in New Zealand had what is called an emergency diagnosis, which is defined operationally as a visit to hospital in the 30 days prior to having their cancer diagnosis show up on the cancer registry. Now there are all sorts of idiosyncrasies in how the data works, and that differs across different countries, but you can see this is substantially higher than in other countries here. So there has been further work done on this for lung cancer and other cancers as well. So with Jason and the C3 group, we've been looking at this recently and very specifically for lung cancer, but also by Te Aotearoa looking across the board at cancers as well. I don't have visual aids for some of the other work we've completed together, but it is good to see for some of these different areas how that work has made real world changes. For instance, if we look at the recent boost to the National Travel Assistance Scheme, which helps people get to the treatment that they need. And we do know that there are real issues and real inequities in how far people have to travel when they have cancer to receive treatment if they live outside a major treatment centre. And one of the other really interesting things is that that doesn't necessarily stop people from getting to treatment, but it will make their lives a heck of a lot more complicated in doing so. And keep half an eye on my watch as well. At this stage, my timeline is kind of all over the show, so I'm going to come back to talking about family for a little bit, and then wind up with a few mini projects that I'll mention just very quickly before finishing up with one last bit on my main topic, and then an outro. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my family for a few seconds here. So when you've got 4 kids and you want some photos, you suddenly realise that pretty much all of your photos of everyone together are taken at the zoo or similar locations. So I've done the best job of finding some other photos where everyone's in a reasonable state of dress. Here's Danny on the left, who was born in 2011. And Danny's there with Lee Randall, who was our nanny who looked after my sister's kids once upon a time, but also our kids, and so was part of our whānau for 10 years as well. In the middle, Mila and Cora, who were born in 2016. It's actually Cora in the pink and Mila in the purple. And Ezra on the right, who was born in 2020, eating an ice cream, which may or may not be his second favourite food after pizza. And just in case you thought I was bluffing, here are a couple of photos from the zoo back in 2018 and 2023. And just to finish up, this is actually the whole Stanley family. This was taken when my brother, who's standing next to me and between me and my sister Claire, this was taken last Christmas when my brother and his family were visiting New Zealand. So really nice to have this photo to share and to also to recognise my family and all the love and support you've given me as well. So over this period, as my family was growing, I was really getting settled into work as well. I knew what I wanted or needed to do with different statistical methods. I had a good working relationship with several groups and friends around and about. I knew what I wanted to teach and had my topics and areas sorted out for that as well. So I'm going to take a few minutes now just to talk about some research areas that didn't quite fit into the overall theme of this talk. And one of these ongoing areas has been mental health, which, having come from psychology and being married to a clinical psychologist, is quite important to me as well. So the team here are largely from primary care. So Tony Dowell on the left, and then at the top Eileen McKinley and Sue Garrett, and Lynn McBain and Sunny Collins, actually from psychological medicine, on the bottom as well. And one of the reasons I've got this team up here is that actually this was the first big project I got stuck into when I joined the medical school. And this was a project evaluating what were called primary mental health initiatives. Now this may sound familiar, but back in 2007, mental health services were under quite a lot of pressure, and the Ministry of Health was quite keen to innovate different ways to do delivery and improve access, especially to people with low to moderate intensity distress, which is quite common in the community. I joined the team when the evaluation was underway, so it was also quite formative to see the interface between academia and the public sector. What was also interesting was to see how reporting and complexity of information got winnowed down as the process went on. We went from something like a 250-page report that's possibly never been seen outside of our research team to a public 80-page report that then had a shorter executive summary in it, which probably got turned into a couple of talking points when it went on to the ministers and the decision makers. This is also familiar, there was also then a change of government, which meant things went better on the back boiler again at that stage. But this really talks about the challenges of affecting change through research. On this slide, I'm going to have a few more other colleagues working in mental health, and again my friend and colleague Ruth Cunningham here on the left, and the wider Element group in the middle with Cherie Gibb and Debbie Peterson as well in here. And Ruth's work has focused on meeting the extended health needs of people who have complex mental health needs. And the consistent message that we have from this is that people living with major conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or major depressive disorder have real complications in terms of getting the care they need. That might mean lower or delayed access to care for their physical health needs, things like cardiovascular disease assessments that don't actually match up with their assessed risk, or not being able to get optimal access to cancer diagnosis pathways because of issues like overshadowing. There's so much time and energy spent on dealing with someone from a mental health perspective that you can't move on to address those other issues. So this is really a systems issue rather than an individual issue, and that's a point that's always worth bearing in mind. So it needs a systems solution, and Ruth's well placed, certainly been well placed to work on this in her role at UOW and her ongoing role at Te Whatu Ora. I should probably say Health New Zealand. I'd also like to mention Susanna Every-Palmer and Matt Jenkins, who are here. Susanna and Matt co-led, along with many others from out of the psychological medicine department here in UOW and across the 3 campuses, work looking at the mental health impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdowns back in 2020. Matt is also originally from Birmingham as well, so I hope you enjoyed the Birmingham photos, Matt. So this was really important work that was organised very rapidly in March and April 2020 and really recognised the mental health toll during the early COVID-19 pandemic in New Zealand. Now I'm going to talk about some other colleagues and friends, Ricky Harris and Donna Cormack. Ricky is also my promotion, Professor Ricky Harris, who's my promotion buddy. We applied for promotion at the same time and kept each other going along for that. And Ricky and Donna have led much of the work in New Zealand exploring how the experience of interpersonal racism impacts on people's health as well as impacts on the way that they can interact with and the care that they receive in healthcare settings in the system as well. These results are from a study that Ricky and I co-led, funded by the HRC, where we followed up people who had reported that they'd been exposed to racism. Those were respondents from the New Zealand Health Survey, and we followed those people up over time and asked them about their subsequent interactions in the health system for this particular slide here. And the bars on the right show you with greater or lesser amounts of statistical precision that actually those who'd been exposed to racism had a greater amount of unmet need for care. They also had, when they interacted with healthcare services, they generally tended to report lower satisfaction with their usual medical centre. They felt that doctors weren't as good as explaining their health and treatment and so on. That's compared to people who hadn't experienced racism. And I won't go into the complexities of this talk about what we did to try and make these two groups as comparable as possible. So this is about experience of racism in general, and you don't need to have been keeping a really close eye on the news recently to see that there are still people out there who deny or downplay the idea that people might be subject to racism in a health setting, whether that's outright racism and stereotyping or more subtle experiences that can alter how people interact with the health system, constantly being asked what your name is, or as you might have seen in reporting recently, how Māori you are. But it is out there and it is happening. And this is a more obvious type of racism in a sense than the kind of systems levels issues that we talk about elsewhere when we're thinking about equity, where services are available and where they are delivered, whether services and funding for services has been set up to meet the needs of Māori rather than being set up for a general population structure where they may have inequitable outcomes. Those are all issues really that disproportionately affect Māori when we're making decisions at a general population level. So I'm going to return to my theme and then one last study before wrapping up. I'll go through this next slide reasonably quickly. The last, not because it's blank, there's some stuff coming up in a second. There have been recent moves in health research to talk about personalised or precision medicine, which is really about trying to tailor the type of care to a person's specific circumstances. In a sense, this is what happens in GP practices around and about anyway, but this is about creating evidence for driving these types of treatments. This is generally a positive development in the sense that the classic style of randomised control trial talks about effects on average across different kinds of people in this study. That's useful, but we often don't know who treatments work for. Sorry, I should have clicked my button to show you the target on the left for personalised medicine. But these finer grained questions are really about dealing with multiple targets at the same time. And to get good answers to these questions about how we can personalise medication, we need bigger and bigger sample sizes to end up with reasonable answers to those questions. So from a sample size point of view and where we are, we're not quite back to James Blynn's studies with scurvy with his 6 treatments for 6 sailors. That was my tongue twister I was going to try and slip in as well, but it was too twisty at this stage. But perhaps we're closer than we'd like for getting some of this evidence. So one of the other areas that we sometimes see in this context are what are called N of 1 studies as well. I'm going to finish up by talking about one last area, which is really to say a lot of evidence that we talk about and make use of in modern health research has been based on large-scale studies, but not all of it has been. And in the mid to late 20th century, issues like chronic gastritis and stomach ulcers were quite widespread. And at the time, it was thought that these were driven by stress and overproduction of stomach acid. In the early 1980s, medical researchers from Australia noticed that the stomach mucosa that they could biopsy from patients with gastritis appeared to be infected with a spiral-like bacteria. That's this bacteria here, Helicobacter pylori, under an electron microscope. They proposed this as a major driver of the symptoms that we're seeing, but this met substantial resistance from what we might call the establishment at that time there. And this led to perhaps what's one of the most striking single participant studies in the last 50 years, which was published in the Medical Journal of Australia. And one of the authors of this, Dr. Barry Marshall, consumed a broth to which they'd added H. pylori bacteria. And about a week later, after some initial bad symptoms, about a week later he had terrible symptoms of gastritis as the infection really took hold. And also, according to his colleagues, this is almost verbatim from the paper, very bad breath. 2 weeks after the start of the experiment, he took a course of antibiotics to finish off the infection, although the symptoms had largely settled down at that stage there. And if that doesn't sound like enough commitment, he also underwent 3 gastroscopies through the study. One at the start to indicate that he didn't have the infection before they'd started this off, once in the middle at about 10 days to confirm that he was infected, and once at the end to see how things were looking at that stage there as well. So this is a striking study in and of its own and was really fundamental in changing our understanding of these conditions. And as a follow-up in 2005, Barry Marshall and his colleague Robin Warren were awarded the Nobel Prize for their larger body of work, not just this study, but linking H. pylori to gastritis and stomach ulcers. Okay, I'm going to talk about one last study and one last team here. Really just linking this into what we'd like to know about H. pylori in Aotearoa. So H. pylori, as you may or may not know, is also related to stomach cancer. So having a long-term infection leads to an increased risk of stomach cancer. This is still a relatively rare outcome, but internationally it's a very preventable risk factor for cancer, and it has a relatively straightforward available treatment. So where does H. pylori sit in New Zealand? The graph on the left here is from a paper by Andrea Teng, who's in the top left here, looking at previous estimates of seroprevalence in New Zealand. And just to orient you slightly to the graph, as you move from left to right, you're moving from essentially people who were born older to people who were born younger. So the older people were at the time of the studies, essentially the higher the risk of being positive for H. pylori was. You can also see between the 3 lines quite large inequities, or very large inequities really, in prevalence according to ethnicity. So the dashed line at the top is for Pacific peoples, the grey line in the middle is for Māori, and the lower line is for European. But this evidence is quite old. In fact, it's all from the 20th century, and these results come from studies across 1983 to 1999. So actually this is a study that the next bit I'm going to show is a study that Dia Safati kicked off when she was here in conjunction with IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, to measure the prevalence of H. pylori in New Zealand, and with a particular focus on looking at the burden of infection for Māori and Pacific and across the age spectrum. And when Dia moved over to be the director of Te Aho Te Kahu in late 2019, Andrea Teng and I agreed and potentially talked Andrea into it, to take on co-leadership of the project. And so that was late 2019, and if I have a last piece of advice for upcoming researchers, it's don't take over a really big complex project requiring extensive fieldwork just before a once-in-a-century pandemic. Having said that, we're now well underway, albeit after a delay, and we should be able to complete a report in 2025. I'm going to leave the slide up here and just to shout out also to my other colleagues, Virginia Signal and Julie Cooper, who are also both here, and Stephen is here as well, and Kirsty Danielson, who are part of our team as well. So just to finish up, what does the study actually look like? How are we going about measuring the prevalence of H. pylori in New Zealand? We're aiming to recruit 1,200 people, and we're asking them to do 3 things. We're getting them to give us a blood sample so we can measure the prevalence in their blood of antibodies to H. pylori. That's reasonably straightforward to do, and it's what's often done in international studies as well. We're asking them to fill out a questionnaire to answer questions about different risk factors for H. pylori and for stomach cancer to understand what's going on. And for people who have a positive blood sample, and anyone else who asks to do it from the get-go as well, we're also asking them to give us a stool sample. So for those who have positive infection, the stool samples are the best ways to work out what's going on. So those who test positive at this stage will go on to have treatment for this, and Stephen is leading our clinical team for this with Virginia and others as well. There is a saying in research that you can never be too pessimistic about recruitment, but I think for this one we're doing quite well given that we're sending everyone 2 bottles marked biohazard and illustrated instructions on how to use a toilet. Okay, that's really the end of the talk, so I am just going to finish up for about a minute just to say thank you to my colleagues, co-authors, friends, students here and elsewhere who make working life so good. Thank you also to the IT department who are here in various places, and the other people who support us and our students for our work. Trevor Williams and the library team, Emma Osborne and Ruth Tumua as well. Funders, the HRC, the Health Research Council, has funded a lot of the work that I've talked about tonight, another work that I've been involved in. The university as well for smaller scale projects, but also for scholarships for students as well, which are really critical for getting work done. I'd also like to thank a few other groups, the New Zealand Health Survey team, Chloe Lynch and Grant Pittams, who have helped us get access to the New Zealand Health Survey for analysis or for further recruitment. The Ministry of Health for the types of national collection data that, particularly in the cancer work, what we deal with so commonly for answering questions. Also Rangaho Aotearoa, formerly Research New Zealand, and Reach, formerly CBG Research, who are 2 research companies we've worked with who've helped us collect data for these and other studies. So I do have one last picture, which is really just to say thank you to my biostatistics colleagues here in Wellington in particular, but my colleagues in Dunedin and Christchurch as well. So on the top right is myself, Gordon Purdy and Taka Keita, who was with us for a few years. At the bottom left is myself and Gordon, and on the right hand side in the glasses and the white striped top is Dallas Sim, who was with us for a few years, and at the bottom right my current colleagues Alice Kim and Robin Willink, who are here as well. So thank you to those people. I'd also like to thank the other people working in biostatistics and those who really kind of set the road towards biostatistics as an academic discipline in New Zealand, in particular, and at Otago as well, many of whom will be here watching tonight or attending. So thank you very much.